In 1915, 28 men found themselves stranded in the Antarctic for over a year and miraculously survived. But for leader Ernest Shackleton, the nightmare was just beginning. There have been many incredible expeditions throughout history, but perhaps above all there is one that truly showcases the strength of the human spirit and the fight to survive no matter how difficult the circumstances may be. This is the unbelievable story of an expedition that took place from 1914 to 1917. This doomed adventure was the brainchild of Ernest Shackleton, whose impressive reputation preceded him. When it came to risky expeditions, this certainly wasn't Shackleton's first one. After all, the Anglo-Irish explorer had already been to the Antarctic twice. At the turn of the Shackleton got his first taste of the icy Antarctic, journeying there as part of the Discovery Expedition's crew. Just a few years later, beginning in 1907, he went again, this time leading the Nimrod expedition. However, it was his third expedition that became his most famous. Setting out in 1914, Shackleton's objective may have sounded simple on paper, but it would prove to be brutal in execution. His ultimate goal? To travel across the entire Antarctic continent on foot. According to him, this would accomplish the one great main object of Antarctic journeyings. At the time, he had no clue that he was about to walk straight into a living nightmare. Shackleton had a detailed plan for how he imagined the expedition to play out. The main feature of this expedition was that there would be two groups, with their own ships working together. The main group was the Weddell Sea Party aboard the Endurance. Their first destination would be the Vassal Bay area. Here the group would split into two, with Shackleton leading 6 members across the continent, and the other 8 members spreading out to perform scientific work. The men responsible for doing the actual crossing would also be accompanied by 2 motor sledges and 69 dogs. They had the very scary challenge of covering a whopping 1,800 miles. If they were successful, they would meet up with the second group of men. The second support group was the Ross Sea Party. They planned to meet the transcontinental explorers on the other side, establishing a base in McMurdo Sound. They would also plant supply depots for the traveling crew, which would be key to their survival. However, keep in mind that this was just the plan, and as we'll see, the plan went completely out the window. To begin with, nailing down the finances for the trip was the first real challenge. In order to make this expedition a reality, Shackleton had to scrounge up enough money, but even this was a messy ordeal. At the bare minimum, Shackleton believed that he'd need at least £50,000, around £6,061,000 today, to get this expedition off the ground. Though the final numbers aren't known, it's estimated that he managed to round up a whopping £80,000. However, even that amount was not quite enough. You see, while Shackleton commanded the Weddell Sea Party, Anois McIntosh commanded the Ross Sea Party. They had to split the money, a pretty important detail that blindsided McIntosh when he took on the job. The truth was that the expedition's financial planning was a total scramble, meaning that McIntosh had no choice but to basically beg for provisions and extra funding, just so that he could properly execute his part of the mission. Little did they know when it came to hardships, this was only the tip of the iceberg. Shackleton couldn't very well begin his expedition without a proper crew, and so he went to wrangle up some risk-takers willing to put their lives on the line. Now that the mission had taken on some mythical layers, one story alleges that Shackleton put out a shocking advertisement in the newspaper to pique the interest of potential crewmen. Supposedly, Shackleton's ad read as follows: "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness. Safe return, doubtful. Honor and recognition in event of success." It might be hard to believe that anyone would want to embark on such a dismal-sounding journey, but shockingly, Shackleton had to wade through as many as 5,000 applications. In the end, though, the two crews ended up with 28 men each. The Endurance began its journey, traveling from Plymouth to Buenos Aires. Here, Shackleton joined the crew, but it would still be many months before they reached the Antarctic. You see, the Endurance found itself held up in South Georgia from November to December, an entire month. This already derailed Shackleton's initial plan of starting the crossing in 1914. Realistically, this just wasn't going to happen, and the plan had to change. Finally, on December 5th, the Endurance set out in the direction of the Antarctic. Shackleton had to change course thanks to a run-in with pack ice that moves in open water. The pack ice quickly became the expedition's greatest enemy, even trapping them for as long as 24 hours at one point. It was a force of nature that Shackleton hadn't planned for. "I had been prepared for evil conditions in the Weddell Sea," but had hoped that the pack would be loose. What we were encountering was a fairly dense pack of a very obstinate character.
The Endurance moved like molasses through the icy waters, but managed to find an easier path on December 22nd. They plowed onward, moving south as the year rolled over into January. Halfway through the month, they arrived at a glacier where they could have successfully landed. That's when Shackleton made a terrible decision he would soon live to regret. Instead of choosing this natural bay as a landing spot, Shackleton wanted to forge ahead. He believed that they were still too far north. Then, on January 18th, disaster struck. The Endurance found itself in a major crisis, thanks to a northerly gale. The strong winds moved the pack ice in such a way that the ship found itself completely stuck. Thomas Ordlise, a crew member, described it as being frozen like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. The expedition had been so close to their destination, just a day away from their landing spot where they could begin their crossing. However, the ice had had her say, and now they were drifting. Caught in her clutches with no escape in sight, the crew tried in vain to break themselves out of the ice. Following Shackleton's orders, they threw everything they had at it. They grabbed saws, picks, and chisels and went to town, but it was a thankless effort. The Endurance did not budge. In the midst of this terrifying development, Shackleton showed a brave face to the crew and did not exhibit a shred of fear. According to one of the ship's surgeons, he stoically explained to the men that they would have to wait out the winter, stuck in the ice. However, deep down, he knew they were in serious trouble. Despite his outwardly calm disposition, Shackleton wasn't as optimistic as he seemed. Behind closed doors, he told the ship's captain, Frank Worsley, "The ship can't live in this skipper. It may be a few months, and it may be only a question of weeks or even days, but what the ice gets, the ice keeps." On February 24th, it became clear to Shackleton that the ship's destination for the winter was sealed. They threw their daily routines to the wind and began preparing for a season of survival. They winterized the interior of the vessel, setting up special quarters for all the men, while outside they made dog loose for their expedition's furry canines. At this point, Shackleton still held on to hope. You see, 3 years before the Endurance hit their stroke of bad luck, another ship had faced a similar experience. The ship known as Deutschland had also found itself at the mercy of the ice. Though it took 6 months for it to escape, everything turned out fine. Based on the survival of the Deutschland, Shackleton believed that his own ship might have a second chance to reach its destination at Basel Bay once the spring season arrived. He couldn't have been more wrong. Though the Endurance experienced a gradual drift northward from February to March, the conditions changed dramatically in April, so much so that Shackleton worried that the vessel would be crushed like an eggshell. For a moment, they were safe, but his prediction was more on the nose than he realized. As time passed, Shackleton grew increasingly worried about his men. The months of May, June, and July in the Antarctic are notoriously dark, which only increased the sense of gloom on board. To combat the shadow of melancholy that hung over everyone and to boost morale, Shackleton focused on upkeeping the crew's physical health and fitness. The men went out walking on the ice, their paths illuminated by moonlight, but that wasn't all. Desperate for some entertainment, the crew staged theatricals and also made an effort to recognize special events like Empire Day. But as they kept themselves as busy as possible, waiting out the dark days, their positive attitudes were no match for the cruel twist of fate in store for them. When August came around, the ice began to break apart, but the resulting pressure terrified Shackleton, who wrote once again, "The Endurance was lucky and remained unscathed." Sadly though, this luck was about to come to a crashing end. On October 24th, the scariest day of the expedition dawned with the pressure from a large floe splintered the hull, causing icy water to rush in. The deafening crack of the wood giving way was a sound the men would never forget. According to one account, the splitting timbers sounded like heavy fireworks and the blasting of guns. In the face of this disaster, the crew jumped into action. The men began transferring their equipment from the bowels of the ship onto the ice. This included provisions and 3 lifeboats. At the same time, they focused their efforts in trying to fix the damaged hull. This was the expedition's greatest nightmare yet. The men desperately tried to pump the water from the vessel. But on October 27th, Shackleton had to acknowledge the cold hard truth. The ship was doomed. It was finally time to abandon it. Though the crew abandoned the ship, it didn't sink for many weeks. While it still remained above the surface, they managed to save whatever they could. However, they couldn't keep everything. Unfortunately,
The party could only hold on to the resources they 100% needed. Anything else like Bibles, sentimental items and books had to be left behind. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the sinking Endurance was what happened to the animals on board. There were 69 dogs on this mission. But sadly, some of the weakest ones had to be shot. As well, the only tomcat on the ship, lovingly called Mrs. Chippy, met the same fate. Though the crew had hoped to set out for land trekking over the ice, they quickly realized how flawed their plan was. The conditions proved too treacherous and Shackleton had to admit defeat. They couldn't go anywhere. Writing about their stranded situation, Shackleton noted, "There was no alternative but to camp once more on the floe and to possess our souls with the patience we could till conditions should appear more favorable for a renewal of the attempt to escape." Though the crew attempted another march at the end of December 1915, it turned out to be another failed endeavor. They spent months drifting northward on the ice, meaning it was only a matter of time before their dwindling food rations became their biggest problem. In order to survive, the crew relied on seal meat, which prevented them from completely obliterating their stores of packaged rations. However, the dogs also relied on the meat to survive. In order to conserve food, Shackleton made the difficult decision to end the lives of even more dogs. 2 teams in January followed by another 2 teams in April. However, that same everything changed. On April 7, 1916, the men clapped their eyes on the one thing they'd been hoping to see, land. They had drifted close enough to Clarence Island and Elephant Island that they could see the craggy terrain. The small flicker of hope that still burned in their hearts suddenly expanded. 2 days later, the ice began to break apart, and with this new development, Shackleton and his crew boarded their lifeboats and headed for the islands. The journey was excruciating. As if their many months' drift weren't depressing enough, the crew's time on the lifeboats was its own unique battle. The men contended with freezing water, squalls, and seasickness, but it was Captain Worsley who managed the unthinkable. Worsley was the one in charge of navigation, and for 6 brutal days, he pointed the crew in the right direction. By the time Elephant Island stood just 30 miles away, he'd gone 80 hours without a wink of sleep. According to Shackleton's second-in-command, Frank Wild, the crew was in a horrifying state. They were beyond exhausted, freezing, ill, and suffering from dysentery. But despite all of this suffering, they finally made it to Elephant Island on April 15th. However, they weren't out of the woods quite yet. It had been an outrageously long time since any of the men had set foot on land. 497 days. But Elephant Island wasn't exactly the picture of salvation. For one, it was a very isolated island. Nobody lived there, and barely anyone ever visited. The crew knew that they couldn't all stay on the island and wait for help. They would certainly perish. Therefore, their one chance of making it back alive would be to send one small team in one of the lifeboats to get help. The lifeboat they chose to make this journey was the James Caird, measuring just 6.9 meters. A shockingly small vessel for such an unbelievably long and dangerous mission. In the end, a group of 6 brave men, including Shackleton and Worsley, resolved to undertake the 800-mile journey all the way back to South Georgia on the James Caird. The next 16 days would be seared into their memories forever. Though the Endurance had sunk, the men somehow managed to hold on to their spirit of endurance, no matter what challenges came hurtling across their paths. Shackleton's rescue mission across the Southern Ocean tested him all over again. According to Shackleton's records, he reported, the boat tossed interminably on the big waves under gray threatening skies. Every surge of the sea was an enemy to be watched and circumvented. Against all the odds, the James Caird made it to South Georgia. However, there was just one problem. Thanks to a hurricane, they wound up on the wrong side of the island. Without a map to aid them, 3 of the men embarked on another journey, this time over land, navigating across glaciers and mountains to reach the whaling station at Stromness. It was a 36-hour trek that pushed them to their limits. Shackleton, Worsley, and Tom Crean were truly at the end of their ropes. When they finally made it to the station, they were like 3 ghosts emerging from the direction of the mountains, or by Worsley's account, a terrible trio of scarecrows. With their entire crew relying on their success, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean finally crossed the finish line, but they certainly looked worse for wear. Being exposed to the harsh elements had them covered in blubber soot and frostbite. However, their work was far from over. Following the rescue of the remaining 3 men aboard the James Caird, it was time to confront the next major challenge, traveling back to Elephant Island to bring the rest of the crew to safety. Unfortunately, The rough winter season prevented Shackleton from launching his rescue mission right away.
In a stressful turn of events, he had to wait over 3 months before heading back to Elephant Island.
Shackleton tried 3 times to sail a ship back to his 22 stranded men, but every attempt ended in disappointment. Meanwhile, on Elephant Island, the crew waited and waited, keeping their tired eyes on the horizon in hopes of seeing a ship. Their optimism began to falter. Finally, a steam tug called the Elcho, which Shackleton found in Chile, became the answer to his struggles. On August 30, 1916, the crew on Elephant Island looked to the ocean and couldn't believe their eyes.
As the story goes, the men were about to dig into their lunch when the Elcho came into view.
The brave group of 6 had set sail on the James Caird 128 days prior. Their unbelievable act of courage had certainly paid off.
Miraculously, every single man that signed up for the expedition survived their ordeal on the ice and on Elephant Island, with all of them reaching sweet salvation in Chile on September 3rd.
Though this was undoubtedly a triumphant happily ever after, for all involved, the trauma of the experience left some deep scars. For one, Ernest Shackleton was never truly the same again. Despite his many ventures to the Antarctic, Shackleton never achieved some of his loftier goals. Not only did he never visit the South Pole, he also never crossed the continent. Even after the Endurance debacle, he still desired to explore that treacherous part of the world. Even wilder, some of his old crewmates even joined him. Shackleton certainly seems to have the willingness to keep going, but sadly, his peers noticed something had changed in him. Reportedly, he seems to have lost some of his spark. Sadly, his final expedition had barely begun when tragedy befell the famed explorer on January 5, 1922. While in South Georgia, 47-year-old Ernest Shackleton suffered a fatal heart attack. Shackleton may have gone out too soon, but his legacy is set in stone. The incredible survival story of the Endurance crew will never be forgotten. That wraps up this journey. Thanks for watching Tales That Tell. Like and subscribe to uncover more of the world's best-kept secrets, and don't forget to dive into even more fascinating facts on podcast as well.